Hey guys, before we start the show, I just want to give a quick shout out to another podcast. Hey, don't forget to check out the Pacific War podcast week by week in association with Kings and Generals. Hey, and don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button so I can feed my two feathery co-hosts. Welcome back to the Pacific War podcast, where I am joined yet again by my friend Ian.
Hello there, thank you for having me.
And we are not filming this immediately after the last podcast, and we are not on beer number 5 or something.
Julian! I don't know where I felt like I could get a little drink around here, do you, bud?
No.
Hey, no, it's like 3.
Okay. I was just going to emphasize this is going to be a slower one. But
for the last hour.
Yeah. This one's going to be a bit more exciting, I think. I think this is the big question that I got the most from the Kings and Generals Discord community. And this is pretty much where this is all coming from. They bombarded me with questions such as, what if Japan attacked USSR during Operation Barbarossa?
Shut the fuck up. Know your fucking place, trash.
What if Pearl Harbor never happened? And today we're going to talk about what if Japan won the Battle of Midway?
Oh, this is exciting.
This one is the rabbit hole question. We're going to go into a lot of alternate history. And as with the previous podcasts, for these what if episodes, we'll call them, we're first going to do a part one, like what happened? What really is the Battle of Midway? How did it go down? Why is it significant, etc. The things that we all know, but we have to go through it. Part 2, what do we think is going to happen that sees Japan win the Battle of Midway? And part 3 is basically like what happens to global history, what happens to the Pacific War afterwards. Is this significant? Might be surprising for the audience members. I had to do a lot of research. That's why I have my trusty laptop in front of me. For you audio listeners, I do have a YouTube version of this if you want to see our ugly mugs.
This is a tougher one because it does get way more hypothetical, because all of a sudden we do have 2 different moving pieces. In Pearl Harbor, it was just, what could the Japanese have done different? Because, I mean, the States was going to get hit irregardless. Like, there's nothing they could really have done differently to prepare themselves for Pearl Harbor. But all of a sudden, Midway, you got 2 carrier fleets. I mean, we have to come up with theories for both of them.
I think one of the most interesting things that I found was the war gamers today, modern historians who looked at it, when they ran 100 battles of Midway, they found that 90 times out of 100, the United States loses, as you would suppose, given certain variables, like, the code breaking is a big one. And that's pretty much how it should have gone down, if you think about it. It should have been on paper, this is a huge loss to the United States. How are they going to match up to the force that's coming at them?
Think about like air assets just available in that theater.
Yeah.
So Midway, a lot of air assets on the ground.
The land-based aircraft,
high altitude bombers
didn't really make a difference. So the high altitude bombers sucked against aircraft carriers.
Missed.
Yeah, I mean, the United States had the torpedo issue. They had pilots didn't know how to dive bomb properly compared to the Japanese. That's another one. High altitude bombers proved ineffective, as the Japanese will find out for themselves in a lot of battles.
Let's get right into it.
What happened?
Okay, let's go off of what happened. Like, how did the Americans technically win Midway?
Number one, let's just people who haven't seen like the Midway movie, for example, actually does a good job of showing us the code breakers. Most significant reason why the United States won was because they were able to pull the Japanese into a trap and know their positions and what assets they had. As
the Japanese are laying a trap for the Americans use that trap to set their own trap, and
it's like it's true. It's a trap of a trap.
Yeah, it's a trap.
If people don't know the story, it was Station Hypno with Joseph Rochefort. Although, like in my podcast, oh my God, I'll talk about this very quick. Doing the podcast for Kings and Generals. For my American audiences, when an American has a French last name, you don't know if they pronounce it in the French way. Or
I would have said Rochefort.
It's like you never know until they say it. It's like, with Chanel, it would be in French if you say Chanel. Flying Tigers captain. It's people like that, and you never know how to pronounce. Anyways, I'm gonna get off that tangent. Well, Rushford at Station Hypo, they break the code, and then they put that sneaky little message in, like they're saying, "Oh, Midway doesn't have enough water," and they put that message into the void. The Japanese pick it up, and the Japanese like, "Oh, that's our, we're gonna go for blah blah blah," and then they realize, okay, so the Japanese target for this operation is going to be Midway. They figure it out.
If we come from the Northeast, they're not going to expect it because they expect our carriers down here. And I love that scene in Midway.
They did a good job of that,
where it was just like a captain or a lieutenant in their what if scenario as they're doing the war game and different end game scenarios of Midway. And he started his scenario with the American carriers are coming from the Northeast, and they obliterated the Japanese.
It's the foreshadowing, right? Of everything.
Yeah,
it's
everyone was like, "No, there's no way that would happen." I guess for this premise to be successful, the Japanese are under the impression they know.
Okay, we're not going to jump ahead, but yes.
Okay, I guess I'm sorry.
Because I mean that has to be the biggest implicator. But for the Battle of Midway, for those who aren't alive, who don't know about it, it was a significant naval battle, took out a large part of the Japanese carrier fleet, like the Big Berth of it. Excuse me.
The illustrious Kido Butai, thought of as invincible at the time. The Americans were scared shitless of it,
as they should have been. Yeah,
no one had gone up against the Kido Butai and survived,
and all the veteran pilots who could potentially be used to train future pilots for the Japanese Empire, a lot of them are lost, and actually the ones who survive Midway are treated terribly and cast out, which is an odd thing. A lot of them end up oddly in positions where they couldn't do much more. It's a side issue, but basically we're seeing the loss of a large amount of carriers for the Japanese. It's a failure.
Ultimately,
350 aircraft, if I'm not mistaken, are taken down.
Yeah.
The United States does
most
not
of them because they have nowhere to land.
The United States does not come out of this unscathed, mind you. They lose, of course, an aircraft carrier and like 100 to almost, is it 200 aircraft? I can't remember.
They lost a lot of aircraft. Majority of them, they're torpedo bombers.
Yeah. And also, it's not talked about often, but the purpose of Midway was twofold. It was a naval engagement for a decisive naval battle to take out the American Pacific Fleet. And, the Army pushed this one. They wanted to invade Midway.
This was the brainchild of Yamamoto. He was thinking this as he's going into Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
He's going to lure out the American carrier fleet, the ones that remained, the fleet that remained after Pearl Harbor. So I guess in this hypothetical scenario, Pearl Harbor happens the way it did.
Well, Pearl Harbor was highly successful. In the last podcast, we asked you,
even if they did more, it wouldn't have changed anything.
In the hypothetical last episode, we said, what if Pearl Harbor was even more successful?
Yeah,
and it's a matter of changing 6 months out of commission to a year, maybe.
So maybe Midway happens 6 months later.
I think Midway should happen when it happens.
Let's go off of the rules. The Battle of Coral Sea happened.
Because
that's important for leading up to Midway, is because this was kind of like Japan was given a freebie. This was not in Yamamoto's plans. The absolute success of the first Battle of the Coral Sea, taking out one carrier and crippling another. That was not in his war strategies at all when it came to his Midway plans, because he expected in the Battle of Midway, he's going to be bringing all the American carriers, including the Lexington and the Yorktown. And ultimately, at the first Battle of Coral Sea, Lexington was sunk. The Yorktown was crippled to the point where the Japanese believed Yorktown was out of commission for the significant future. And ultimately, the Yorktown limped back to Pearl, was repaired in miracle repair. Like you cannot say like the engineers are telling Nimitz it's going to take 6 months to repair it, and Nimitz turns around and says, "You have 3 days,"
and they leave on the ship and repair it as it goes.
As the battle's happening, as they're launching aircraft in the Battle of Midway, they're still doing critical repairs on it.
Yeah, the unsung heroes, eh? It's just like the Seabees in the Pacific War, though. Well, actually, I think they get a lot of glory now, but in the beginning, the unsung heroes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think Midway has to happen at the same time. The only thing I would give it, like, we don't even, honestly, even with the code being broken, Midway is a colossal freak accident. The
Yeah,
Japanese
it's
easily
just
could have won.
like I was saying, like Coral Sea is a blessing that lands in the lap of the Japanese.
Yeah.
Midway is a blessing that lands in the lap of the
Americans.
Americans. That just circumstances unfolds in their favor that nobody really could have predicted.
It's a lot of luck. It's a lot of luck.
You know, as the bombings of Midway are well, let's start from the beginning. What happens at Midway? The Kido Butai launches their strike bombers and fighters to start leveling Midway, preparing for the amphibious assault. And it was it Genda, Commander Genda, who messaged Nagumo that another sortie is required to pacify
and that
Midway.
they didn't see much land-based aircraft.
They saw zero land-based aircraft
because they were incoming,
and that should have been the ding. Something's up. Why?
Well, Nagumo sent search planes. He's like, okay, something's going on here, but they misidentified multiple times. He kept stressing, is it a carrier? And they're like, it's a force, we don't know if it's a carrier. And then eventually, like, okay, it's a carrier. And Nagumo's like, oh.
But even then, like that this is their earliest warning when they see no long range bombers, nothing on the airfields, nothing.
Yeah,
the Americans, all their aircraft are somewhere else. That should have been the wake up call. Okay, because if they're doing drills or whatever, they do not send every aircraft up at the same time. These are large scale operations. If every aircraft is in the air, that means something is going on, and that's when should have been the wake up call. Oh, okay, they know we're here.
They should have just peeled off.
Yeah,
they really should have. And I mean, I'm going to get into it later. I was surprised to know this. The invasion aspect of this is a blunder of its own. They probably would have not taken Midway, and I mean by an absolute long shot. If they invaded Midway at the time that they were doing it, it was a landslide victory for the American land forces. I mean, mind you, the naval engagement, as we're saying, like, okay, the United States Navy is destroyed.
That was the ultimate objective.
The naval victory.
Well, you got to take Midway because Midway is the Americans' own, like most Western.
It's not as useful as
launch point.
It's very small. It's a very small island.
Big airfields.
Big airfields.
That's all that matters.
The thing is, it doesn't give you a beachhead really for Oahu, Hawaii. You still can't do much there.
No, but it denies your enemy access to those airfields. That denies them land-based aircraft in that vicinity, and the Japanese war strategy was in their defensive circle around Japan was have airfields everywhere, so you have a mobile aircraft surface fleet, and you have airfields everywhere, and everyone working in cohesion.
The thing is, they can't have it because let's say they win the engagement, they kill the Americans. How do you hold it? Where's your fuel? Your home islands are here. It's Midway. It's called Midway for a reason. How are the Americans not going to take it back instantaneous?
I don't think they would use it as for
they,
airfield.
It would be a small little base,
bunker down, and just deny it from the Americans.
Garrison, a few thousand guys, probably,
bunkered down as the Japanese proved that they are extremely successful in the other islands of really like thinking outside the bag, how to make these small islands absolute fortresses.
Actually, the more I think about it, it's more like Kiska. So they take one of like those Alaskan islands like they did. That's basically Midway. Not many people are going to be on it, and if the Americans contest, well, they're going to get it, and the Japanese know. And what can they do? They can't logistically do anything. It's too far away. They don't have the fuel or capability of really surrounding or holding it. So yeah.
We really are jumping forward.
I know,
we need to go back to the prelude to Midway.
So let's talk about the Japanese part 2. The Japanese win the Battle of Midway, which is really inevitable, like they should have.
But how?
I mean,
let's let's because we do have to tackle that.
Yeah.
So let's just say there's many ways that it can be done. You see that the land-based aircraft are not there. Warning flag in Nagumo's head. Ultimately, like what is the downfall of the Kido Butai in this battle is he is stuck in transition of
Nagumo's
changing
dilemma,
weapons,
yes.
changing weapons from naval weapons to surface weapons, back to naval weapons. So that problem is not there.
He actually, because Nagumo was an old guy and he had the old mentality that you have to go by rigid code and command. You don't do piecemeals in the Japanese.
You don't launch 12 aircraft. You launch everything at once.
Do you want to say that Nagumo had a few beers as we have today? And Nagumo's like, yeah, outfit them for a carrier battle. No land. We're not going to hit the second wave. We are going to prepare. And then he sends them off.
Well, he had half his force ready for naval engagement. And then he received the message that, okay, another sortie is required to pacify the island. And so then he started the transition of switching from anti-naval weapon, like anti-ship torpedoes and bombs, over to ground weapons. And then minutes, like not long after, he received reports that American carriers in the vicinity. And then, okay, switch back. And they're already halfway through switching.
Worst situation, a powder keg, because everything is literally on the hangars, ready to just blow up with whatever gets
the
hit.
film Midway has a really good scene of that just the guy in the hangar looking around at all the armaments that is, like, you got to remember, as you're switching weapons, you take the your armaments, your bombs, your torpedoes off of the racks and that, and now they're just left out in the open. Whereas beforehand, carriers already a powder keg, they're stashed in a way that it's less likely that once one explodes, it'll hit another section of the ship where armaments are stored. But in this case, they were just everywhere. So one hits and the entire boat will go up. So let's say that never happens. He never goes into the Nagumo dilemma. He never switches.
Good for him.
That wave comes back. Those ones are immediately outfitted to naval weapons. But as Midway is happening, like those aircraft weren't even able to land.
You know, based off the premises that you've made, the reports immediately from the offset, okay, there's no planes on Midway. And Nagumo just says in his head,
wait a minute. Who are you?
And I mean, he knew, he even said there has to be carriers around. And it was his greatest fear, right? And he's like, okay, I'm just going to put my feet down. We are not doing a second wave into Midway. We are going to prepare for a carrier battle.
Nice.
So that's what he does. And the Americans, regardless of his decisions, are already incoming because they had already...
they had already launched at that point.
So the cap could be stronger now for the Japanese because, I mean, their anti-aircraft guns were not going to help. They're shit.
No,
only the cap.
And here's the kicker in my mind that wins Midway. And one of the reasons that they lost is they expended all their zeros on the torpedo bombers, which was completely unnecessary because the torpedo bombers were going into into their runs, and the escort vessels just had them lined up like ducks in a barrel. But the blood hungry Zero pilots, they were not missing this opportunity to get a kill. All of them just
it's prestige too.
Lost their high altitude positions to go down to water level almost and take down these torpedo bombers. And as soon as they had finished mopping up the torpedo bombers, that's when the different waves of dive bombers started coming in from different directions, and they had not nearly enough zeros at high altitude at that point to counter this threat. So it was ultimately dive bombers landing unimpeded on the Japanese carriers. Now, let's say the Zeros had a little bit more discipline.
They are disciplined.
They're very disciplined,
but they
they're
are
also hungry.
It's a prestigious thing. You want to knock out the of course.
You want that stripe on the side of your aircraft.
And let's be honest, we have the foresight of knowing these are incoming forces. They don't know that there is another incoming force. Like maybe it's just a torpedo bomb. I don't know. What do they think the Americans are doing? They can't predict what the American formation is going to be. because they're only taught certain things that are like from
And
back
that,
in the
and
20s
it was
maybe.
pure fluke. The Americans didn't even know where the Japanese were, and they just simultaneously
At the same time, yeah, it's
appeared.
crazy. Yeah.
This is like,
It's
you
magic, yeah.
cannot get more of a miracle than that.
That's why everyone loves this battle so much. It's such a sorry for the F-bomb. It's a clusterfuck.
Historically, a victory does not land in your lap like that.
Yeah.
But so the zeros are up there, high altitude. The dive bomber waves are coming in, but now all of a sudden, there's a swarm of zeros up there as well. Those dive bombers do not have the time nor what I'm trying to say is like, now all of a sudden there is retaliation to the dive bombers. They do not have this free entrance into the carriers unimpeded, making the most perfect shots because you have all the time in the world in that. It's just the AA guns from the carriers, and like every single carrier has that big red dot. Aim for that.
Yeah. Well,
but now all of a sudden, while you're going into your dive bomb run, you have a squad of zeros coming in from your left. You got a squad of zeros coming in from your right, and you're just okay. You're starting to panic. Your aim is off. You launch your bomb 500 feet off to the right. You pull out, and the zeros clean you up. The zeros would clean up.
It's gonna be bad.
Yeah.
And the zeros, the few survivors that are going back to their carriers, I don't know, it's going to be a few valves or something going to follow them. They're going to find those carriers immediately, and the Kido Butai is going
and
to
also
lay
now
waste.
We do not have the Nagumo dilemma, which stopped a lot of zeros from returning, because not only was he stuck refitting his strike aircraft, it was either I refit all my aircraft, or I let my zeros come back in, refit, go back out.
And he did.
He couldn't do anything. He was stuck.
Yeah, but now he can.
Yeah,
those zeros are
yeah,
fresh.
he did, and that stalled the refitting another 45 minutes, and so your every single one of your carriers is still powder keg. Can you imagine?
Because the Japanese, and when he's attacking the U.S. aircraft carriers, again, Nagumo is an old style guy. It's not going to be a piecemeal. He's going to do a full scale launch. The freaking American carrier force is going to get absolutely destroyed.
Look, one carrier got its wing off.
Yeah.
And one carrier got its wing off, and it was the was it the Akagi? Well, it's not important, but it was ultimately the carrier went down later on, but it was the last surviving carrier after that strike of the big strike from the Americans.
Oh, the Hiryu was the last one that tried to salvage the situation.
And it was able to launch off a limited wing, last ditch effort, and that limited air component ended over the Yorktown and just obliterated the shit out of it.
I mean, the Yorktown got so smashed up, but
the Yorktown survived, but
it's limping,
limping, and then ultimately, I think it was a submarine that took it out later on. But
ironically,
But there was few Japanese losses from that launch. It just shows, imagine a full air complement.
I don't think it's any question that they're taking out the American fleet, and they're badly taking them out. So let's get past. Okay, they win. They win the naval battle that is Midway, and I don't want. I mean,
that's the Easy Enterprise. That's the Hornet.
Yeah.
That's the Yorktown. All down.
They're gone, and going by the actual history, what was supposed to happen, and Yamamoto didn't want this to happen. It was kind of, what do you call it? He was negotiating with the army about
and this was they
had to invade,
because this was another gamble of Yamamoto, and in order to be given the approval of this operation, it had to have an army element to it.
So they had to invade Midway Atoll. And ironically, and I had to look this up myself because I found this funny. When I found out, I said to myself, okay, I need to look at the numbers. What's going to happen when they invade Midway? Because a lot of people were saying, especially the book Shattered Sword, of course, says it's a massacre. The Japanese don't even manage anything in the Midway Atoll. And there's a good reason for it, and you'll find out. But I was looking at the names, and I was like, who's in command of the forces that's leading the invasion? And it's Ichiki. The guy, if people really know their Pacific War history, that was in charge of one of the landings in Guadalcanal and got his entire force annihilated. one of the most embarrassing defeats in Japanese history. And this guy's in charge of the 5,000 Japanese soldiers that are going to attack an island that has basically the same amount of forces defending it in unbelievable conditions. Pillboxes, 7-inch guns, 5-inch guns. And
It's a fortress.
to make
It's
things
an absolute fortress.
make things worse, there's a freaking raised reef barrier 200 yards around the atoll. So they got to drop guys off and they're going to go through the water nice and slow. We're talking the movie Saving Private Ryan, D-Day times 1,000. They are shot up to pieces. There is no taking the island.
Their only saving grace in this scenario
is the Air Force.
Is the Air Force from the Kido Butai. It's because now they've dealt with the carriers. Now they can
You can only do so much damage with the Air Force against these pillboxes.
Because you're limited to 500, 1,000 pound bombs.
Yeah, that's the thing. People need to realize this. These are not heavy bombers. These are bombers.
A lot of the munitions used at that time, they're more high explosive. They're not, deep penetrating munitions. Like designed for taking out pillboxes or bunkers.
Before we did this podcast,
and that proves so. Later on in the war between the Americans and the Japanese, as the Americans are invading Japanese islands, and they'll bombard an island for weeks at a time.
Oh yeah,
bomb the incredible hell out of it, and then they show up on the island, and it's like Japanese aren't even phased because they're all underground. And so it would be a similar scenario for the Americans in this case.
But for the excuse of alternate history, I feel, even though, and I'm telling you right now as the audience, they're not taking Midway in 42 during the Battle of Midway. Perhaps if they come back, because logistically with the force that they had, it's impossible. It's real, even with the Air Force, because they're losing so many aircraft are going to get destroyed during it. Maybe if they come back, they could take it. I don't, let's say they take it. They can't hold it because they can't surround, even with the United States Pacific Fleet being as completely destroyed as it is from the Battle of Midway. They simply aren't taking Midway. It's too far away logistically.
You got to remember, Midway is that, and it's a good name for the island. It's a middle point of the Pacific,
and it's right close enough to Oahu.
Think about that logistic line.
All the aircrafts on Oahu, guess what the fuck they're going to do? As soon as your ships, who have to leave because you don't have the fuel and you can't sit around, leave, the American submarine fleet.
I was just about to bring up the American submarine fleet. All of a sudden has a logistic line that they're gonna prey upon.
Yeah, because if you thought this was Midway is a beachhead to take Oahu in 1942 has like 100,000 regular military personnel on the island, tank battalions. It's stored to the teeth. The Japanese, with everything they got, couldn't hope to take it because they got
what they would do is it would be bait.
Yeah,
and this was Yamamoto's ultimate plan after the success of Midway. Was okay. We knocked out the American Navy now officially, but the juggernaut is still rolling. It's producing carriers. It's repairing its vessels. Yamamoto knew that if he destroyed this American force, another one's going to come, and it's not going to take very long.
This is all part of the plan.
But his force is technologically and numerically superior at that point, and he would address each incoming fleet periodically. And his idea was, okay, we're just going to stay technologically superior. They'll just keep throwing a new fleet at us. We take that fleet out, and we just keep doing that until they sue for peace.
So I'll bring this up right away. Yamamoto's grand vision would have been complete had the Battle of Midway been done, because his whole plan was, number one, we're going to do this raid in Pearl Harbor to knock out what hopefully is the Pacific Fleet, or more or less most of it. Number two, Nanshinran. We got to get the resources, everything in the Dutch East Indies, all blah, blah, Malaya, Singapore, everything has to go according to plan. Then number three, decisive naval victory, which would have been Midway.
Yeah.
Then he said to himself, I hope at that point the United States will come to a position where it'll come to the table and negotiate for a peace.
Is it worth fighting for this victory on their side?
That is the plan. and he himself didn't think it was going to happen. He really thought the United States is not going to sue for peace. There's no way. Why would they?
They were galvanized.
And
Pearl Harbor galvanized them into winning the war at all costs.
And then people, I'm sorry, the audience is probably screaming at me at the comments. Had Japan won the Battle of Midway, some people are going to say, oh, well, isn't FDR's government going to collapse? I mean, this is a tremendous blunder. How are they going to come back from this? Well, they're not. I mean, maybe they don't even take Midway Island. That could be a minor victory, you could say. But I don't think
so inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, holding Midway or not. It's knocking out that fleet. That's the only thing that mattered.
For the United States, I don't think this is breaking the FDR's cabinet or his government. He's not saying anything to the Japanese. They're back in the war. Nothing's happening that way, and we're continuing. And then it comes down to the issue of productivity.
I gotta say, it might enrage Eisenhower.
Oh,
not Eisenhower at this point. It's gonna enrage Churchill because all of a sudden the Americans are because
we're gonna talk about
America
Europe
promised.
First, yeah.
America promised Europe first, and at that
There's a
point, it's like,
butterfly
okay,
effect,
well,
yes.
yeah, well, all this entire scenario is butterfly effect.
But I wanted to establish this, that beyond a doubt, I do not believe they are going to the peace table. I do not think they're negotiating. No.
Absolutely not. If anything, they're just going to ramp up efforts slightly, a little bit more efficient, with more emphasis on the Pacific.
Now, it has to be said here and now, the United States didn't ramp up its production until early 43. And when it did, in the words of another guy, they're pulling out a carrier about every 2 months.
And these are up to date, top of the line carriers.
If you thought those numbers were incredible, imagine this scenario in desperation. I think those numbers could even go up, but they're good enough. So the United States is building a brand new Pacific fleet every year. It's not happening.
And Yamamoto had planned to knock out every single said fleet.
And you know what? I don't think the United States is going to engage them all willy-nilly again, because they just lost Midway.
Would they turtle up and turtle up? Okay, let's wait till we're numerically advantageous. Right. But this slows down the entire war effort
big time
everywhere else.
The war is going longer for sure. Now, as people who watch this and aren't listening on Podbean, they'll notice I'm looking at my laptop a lot right now. This is where I had to scramble into production notes and everything. I really wanted to look into this. I'm thinking to myself, I read Shattered Sword. Shattered Sword had a lot to say about the scenario, but like, what happens at Midway is a loss for the Americans. Like, there's so many things that are in the world going on that are going to change. And a big one is the Europe first strategy as it was. So 15%, the United States is sending 50% of its war materials into the Pacific. They're keeping 15% at
land base, but
yeah,
naval and aircraft wise, they were sending a lot to the Pacific.
Well,
and
in general,
Churchill was up in arms in the first year of the war, because
but
he felt like he was being neglected in Europe.
Yeah.
That the States was, and it was Admiral King. That Admiral King looked at the situation as like, look, we can't. We cannot operate in the Pacific without. We cannot operate a war in the Pacific without this minimum threshold.
So in our timeline, 70% went to Europe, the Europe first strategy. If Midway is a success for the Japanese, what does this actually mean? Does it mean that the United States will now tip the favor to the Pacific, or do they go full blown into Europe? And that's actually a unique question. A lot of people have a lot of ideas on that. I looked through a lot of...
I suppose that could go either way.
I actually looked into a lot of historians who've talked about this, and I found one interesting point, and it was, if the United States decides to pull more percentage of its war materials in the Pacific, there's big situations that won't occur in our timeline, like the Wasp being the carrier Wasp being used in like something like the Mediterranean. Like Malta could be taken by the Axis powers because it won't be there. The Wasp will be in the Pacific because it's necessary. It needs to be there because they're going to operate in there still. And this changes a lot of the course of the Atlantic Mediterranean seas, and it's a butterfly effect. And this is way too much for a podcast to talk about, but like it's crazy, you know.
Actually, it would really leave the Aleutian Islands open. People forget about that.
Yeah,
Like
but not
how,
much there.
like, yes, the west coast of the states, very far from Japan, but the Aleutian Islands and Alaska, somewhat close to Japan.
And this one is a big one I wanted to bring up because I wasn't aware of this until I did some research. In 1942, Secretary of War Henry Stimson was under pressure because of Churchill, who, because they were refusing to do the early cross-channel attack, like D-Day, right?
Yeah.
Like the United States wasn't pulling together everything, and even Britain didn't want to do it against Germany. So Stimson was in a pinch in 1942, and he began to push for a defensive stance in Europe and for a more Pacific first strategy. So he was beginning to say, hey, can we go more towards the Pacific? Which, Churchill probably had a heart attack and downed a few scotches, but FDR vetoed it because of the Battle of Midway success. The Battle of Midway success happened when Stimson was talking to him. So if the Battle of Midway is not a success, could Stimson get his wish to pull more resources into the Pacific?
And King is admiral of the entire Navy, Pacific and Atlantic, and he's pushing hard for
very
this,
underappreciated admiral, by the way.
with contention from General Marshall, his counterpart in the army.
So if they put more assets into the Pacific, it means, because look at this as a balance scale. And I mean, I'm doing things with my hands right now. I'm realizing most of my audio listeners is silly.
You can hear the hands.
Things in Europe are going to go worse. The North African campaign is not going to go as well. Malta could fall. There's a lot of things that could happen if they pull into the Pacific. If they pull everything out of the Pacific, which I kind of would do if I was in their circumstance, and you went Europe first, my God, maybe Germany falls even earlier. This is a huge weird butterfly effect. Like, this is all
also history. Like, well, you're talking about Malta. Where does the Kido Butai go next if it doesn't lose 4 carriers at Midway? This is a 6 carrier. Well, the Kido Butai is technically 8 carriers, but let's say those 6 carriers, where do they go next? I'm guessing they're going to harass the Mediterranean. And imagine,
no, not that far. Not that far. It's too much. The Indian Ocean.
Well, Indian Ocean, and from there you're hitting Egypt. You're all of a sudden.
No, not Egypt. Come on, the British had a navy in the Mediterranean, and they had land-based aircraft. You can't just attack those. What I think
it opens up the war for the Kido Butai versus that area, and now all of a sudden the North Africa campaign for the Allies is a different story.
Well, yes. And for a very important reason, if the United States Navy is destroyed at the Battle of Midway, Australia is in a very bad position. And who is the backbone in the North African campaign? The Australians were making the difference. If they have to pull back to potentially protect their homeland, which will never be attacked because Japan could never actually attack Australia. It's ridiculous.
Too many snakes and scorpions.
Exactly. Kangaroos.
The kangaroo.
Yeah, it's a very dangerous
Australia's
animal.
#1 defender.
Let's not forget the Great Emu War.
Or the Great American Kangaroo War. I learned about it on Grand Theft Auto 3.
Oh, jeez. Okay, yeah. So Australia might have to pull back most of its forces to protect the homeland, and North Africa could go differently. But from what I can gather, I really wanted to look at all the places Japan failed to take that it wanted. They're going to win now because the Americans aren't involved. So Ceylon, today it's Sri Lanka, they're taken. Big blow to the British. New Hebrides, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, Guadalcanal isn't happening, and maybe for another year.
How do you move amphibious landing vessels without a fleet to support it?
Moresby, all of that.
Port Moresby's gone.
Yeah, Moresby's gone. Is Australia invaded? No.
The Japanese absolutely consolidate their defensive ring on the Pacific. Absolutely. And then gives them the opportunity to not be on the, because after Midway, they go on the defense. They are never on the offense ever again.
Good point. Victory disease is bigger and badder. They could lose somewhere else. Well, I mean, there's no one really to take the Navy down, but they could go after, they could chew a target so big. Imagine, like, because the IGA were the idiots who thought they could attack Australia. If they actually did, which is impossible numeric, it doesn't make sense in numbers. No, sorry, no, they can't attack Australia. It doesn't make sense. But they could attack all sorts of places. They could establish a greater zone.
Cut off Australia because it's the lifeline for Australia is coming from the States.
But the Japanese
that supply lifeline,
yeah,
and it was kept in service by Admiral Fletcher of the Americans post Pearl Harbor. Like, he pushed his carriers there. But that was the first thing he did when Roosevelt told Nimitz, "Get your carriers out of Pearl, don't come back." It was Fletcher. He went and secured that supply line, and eventually the Coral Sea is a byproduct of that because they want to be able to strangle that. Now the Americans have no forces to secure that supply line. Australia is cut off. They may not invade Australia, but Australia is cut off.
I've even read reports of people asking would Australia sue for peace, and I simply can't see it happening.
They wouldn't sue for peace, but they're not sending troops anywhere.
Especially in North Africa. That's actually the crucial thing, is the North.
As I'm getting at, like Midway, the first consequence of it would be North Africa is an entirely different campaign.
And I have to admit, I'm not a specialist when it comes to the North African campaign, but I thought if the Australians are protecting their homeland, that means like Alamein is falling and all this. But I'm reading people on forums who are much more credible than me, and they're saying even if the Australians are not there, they thought the British would probably still hold a lot of the places. So I'm like, I guess maybe the United States could even push more in the Atlantic to get more troops in Algeria to come over. Like, maybe North Africa isn't a lot. Maybe the Desert Fox isn't winning that.
But that's if they're given this, like given that go ahead to go for a North Africa campaign.
Yeah.
Or if they're going to try and take back the Pacific. Or they're just going to cut their losses, say the Pacific's a loss, we're going to roll up Europe, and then we'll deal with Japan after. And then at that point, Japan has their hold so fucking firm, pardon my French, on the Pacific. Like we look at the invasions of the Japanese like home islands, like their home territories in 44 and 45, how dug in they were. Now give them a few more years.
I mean, it's happening though. It's just years later.
Think about how more extensive these trench networks and fortifications are.
Yes, but they're not going to win. That's the thing, because just by the numbers, they're going to get. Because the Navy will be destroyed, and if the Navy's destroyed, they don't get supplies. They're dead in the islands. Guadalcanal or Death Island,
We're talking like 47, 48 at that point.
And I actually want to bring this into like the big part 3, which is the rabbit hole global history perspective. I saw some people that talked about this, and this is what raised some eyebrows for me. Okay, let's say things go crazy. Japanese win Midway. They take all the places that I just said, like Samoa and all of them. They establish really firm beachheads, like you're saying, and it goes much longer. The United States is like, Europe first is the strategy that they were doing. And they said, okay, we're going to go after Europe first. Still, Japan, the process of the Pacific War is still happening. It's years behind, or maybe 4 months behind, as a lot of people have indicated. And this is what's so interesting to me. The Manhattan Project finishes, and they're not close enough to hit mainland Japan, but all their bombers are coming from London to hit Germany. Do they nuke Germany? And a lot of people, historians who look into even forum people, like I'm not going to be saying they're all credible, are saying to themselves, in this circumstance, does Berlin get nuked?
And that would stop the Soviets in their tracks.
It's the same reason Japan was nuked, was to stop the Soviets. I know Americans don't like to hear that's the truth. So
absolutely.
This changes the course of all history. The Soviets, freaking out, attack all of the Japanese assets in Asia. So we're talking about all of Korea, Manchuria and all that. and they wipe them out. I mean, the Japanese had nothing to fight the Soviets. We're seeing a whole different world order. It's actually similar to our last podcast, though. Japanese main islands can't be attacked by the Russians, and the Japanese Navy is alive. So this is actually interesting.
I mean, diplomatically, would there be a sue for peace and, dare I say, an alliance between the Empire of Japan, not Japan, but the Empire of Japan would live on and sue for peace and an alliance with the States?
Because who is the ultimate enemy of Japan? Communism. That was the biggest issue for the Japanese, and now they actually have the enemy that they foresaw. And they say to the lumbering beast, which is the Americans, hey, you're about to pretty much defeat us. We're going to surrender to you on the condition you let our emperor live. And the Americans are like, pay us a gajillion. Who knows what the reparations are for this terrible war, and it's going to be awful. But we're looking at
you allow us to operate within your borders.
It's the same as we're seeing in our timeline,
because then all of a sudden you skip having to take space, and the Empire gives you access to their airfields in close proximity to Russia and Russian assets, and all of a sudden that you have Germany was just nuked by the Americans,
and they would kill Hitler immediately, and they would drop the war immediately, because they'd be like, look, the communists are a bigger threat. You just made Berlin a wasteland, and maybe I don't even poor people in Dresden are probably getting nuked. Who knows? It's gonna be awful. Maybe it's one nuke. Who knows? I don't even know. I mean, and you know what? It's gonna be Churchill who says, "Do it."
Kill him now.
I shouldn't.
Do it.
The Emperor, he is. It's gonna be awful.
Never have more nukes been needed than they are. We will nuke the beaches. We will nuke the cities. We will nuke the fields.
It's gonna be just awful. Why not? He's even be like, "Hey, do you have one left for India?" And then FDR's like, "What?"
We will nuke India. Staunch.
I'm sorry, Indian audience. I'm just cracking a joke at the obvious. Churchill was terrible to India. It's unforgivable what happened.
Yeah.
But that's the alternate history. Look at that.
That's the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
There's so many what if scenarios, and ultimately the American carrier fleet being taken out at Midway really opens the door to so much possibility.
But inevitably, in the grand scheme of things,
if the States wanted to continue the war against the Empire, the States is going to win. They're going to roll out. They're going to roll out. They're going to keep rolling out. One point I did want to mention earlier, though, and is one of the successes for American victories later on in the war, is at Midway. They have so many great veteran pilots. These are their veteran pilots. After Midway, they start getting circulated back into the training system back at home, and they start training the next generation of pilots, and they just keep going through. And a lot of tactics came out from Coral Sea and Midway, and I forget the name of
McCluskey.
It's not McCluskey. It's another commander, and he's the one who came up with the how to deal with Zeros with inferior aircraft.
With Wildcats.
It was a whole it was this whole technical thing, and pilots like these are now gone, and so the veteran pilots of the Americans are gone. There's no one really to train. They're gonna keep going from the book rather than people who've gone from the book and say, okay, that didn't actually work. Now instead, the Japanese can now start rotating pilots back home, training their next generation of pilots, which never happened because they lost majority of their pilots, their veteran pilots, and these are the best pilots in the world. They lost majority of them at Midway because they had nowhere to land, and they just land in the ocean and die in the ocean. And
Yeah. it's
think
gonna set them
about
back.
that. Like it does reinvigorate the Japanese carrier force for the next few years, that they do start a program of training pilots rather than getting kamikaze pilots or amateur pilots that the Americans.
Well, that was a necessity. Yeah.
Near the end of the war, the Americans, like they were disgusted with themselves when they went into dogfights with the Japanese. They said it was like shooting children.
Well, it was children. These guys didn't know how to. They were given a few weeks. Especially the kamikaze pilots weren't even given adequate. The aircrafts were just jimmy rigs, that they weren't there to do anything else. It was awful. And I mean, like, we didn't really go into it much, but Guadalcanal is like it's not really what it was for our timeline. It's completely different.
The Marine Corps. Think about the impact on the Marine Corps, because the Marine Corps got their start in the Pacific War. Like,
well, I don't think just because the United States carriers are taken out doesn't mean they don't sneak units from Australia and the United States on the Guadalcanal.
They do not have large scale amphibious invasions happening.
Neither did the Japanese, and they did it.
No, but
they can't support it at all. They're going to be basically in the same circumstances as the Japanese. It's terrible logistics, garbage logistics.
Well, it was terrible to begin with for the American Marines in the our current timeline, and that, like, in this
the real
like
world.
butterfly no, but in this butterfly effect world, the Marines do not have the support necessary to carry off their large scale invasions.
They don't have supplies.
Small scale, perhaps.
No support, bombardments, no nothing.
You know, in best case scenarios, well, like, as history tells, like it was terrible for the Marines as it was. Yeah. Now it's going to get way worse.
It's still bad for the Japanese. It's better for the Japanese, though, because maybe now they'll have food on the islands.
And will not resort to cannibalism as much.
Yeah, that was a really bad one. Guadalcanal, the Death Island, and
Guinea.
Well, stating that, I'm looking at the time. I think we reached a 45-minute angler, but
I think the best thing that we got to was America going Europe.
It's really different because just because you've defeated these naval assets doesn't mean that the United States.
Japan never had plans of invading.
They can't even take Hawaii.
Like, I know the Man in the High Castle. Like,
it's so ridiculous.
Like that. No, it's not. It's not feasible.
I asked our guest if he wanted to. I don't know enough
about Man in the High Castles to say, but I know enough to say.
It's so funny.
No,
so funny. They basically, the premise of the history behind the Man in the High Castle is the spirit of Bushido basically allows the Japanese to attack the West Coast. It's ridiculous.
I'm just imagining, like, you know, the Japanese invading like Compton and that.
No, like, come on, like California is not what it is today.
Everyone has guns in the States.
Yeah, that's not happening. It's funny that we're making these arguments. We're not even American. We're like,
well, we're North American.
Oh yeah, sure.
We have more guns than America
per capita. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Maybe Alaska gets taken, but I mean, what are you gonna do?
Well, that's what I was saying earlier. The Aleutians, the Alaskans, are within reach of.
Yeah, you could take but I mean, even Alaska is gonna.
I mean, what does that do for us? Also, because we have the Yukon there, and
I mean,
BC.
What do we actually in 1940s? Do we have anything there?
The Aleutian Islands wasn't a strategic gain if they got it in Midway. After Midway, because that was the simultaneous plan happening at the same time. That's where the other two carriers were. It was more for show. We can hit you on your home turf also.
It's hard for me not to envision Axis and Allies right now. Like, I'm thinking of my Axis and Allies. It's a board game. Sorry for those.
I would love to see the Empire coming through, like, our tundra and stuff.
Oh my, yeah, like, no, come on. Like, they can't.
If they struggle against the Russians in their winter, they're not going to have a fun time in ours, because we're very similar, if not worse.
like good luck learning from the few groups of the the Inuktitut speaking people up there how to survive in that wilderness. You're not gonna at the Japanese are not gonna do well up there. It's
Like speaking of winter, like we're minus 35 and we're only in southern Canada, and like
that's
up
true.
there, like come on.
Like my car, it took a while to start today. If you want a little knowledge about Canadian winter, it's kind of rough.
This war.
This war is terrible. All right, so that's been the third episode of this ongoing stuff. I really hope the audience likes this. I hope you attack me without mercy in the comments. But guess what? YouTube said that you can't see the like or dislike button anymore. So I can know how you feel about me, but no one else can see it.
Like or dislike, I'll still sleep at night. Don't worry.
No, but please pelt us with more questions about all of the goofy stuff that you want to hear, because I got my friend Ian, I got tons of others, even some people doing interviews. We're going to tackle every question you can think of, because I'm really going to try and hit this while it's hot with my personal channel, because I know a lot of you are from Kings and Generals, and I still am going to do for the next 4 years the Pacific War podcast week by week. Don't you worry. Diligently writing that, and it's taking up all my life, all of my life.
Well, it was a lot of fun doing this.
Yeah.
I gotta say, this is a topic that I've been trying to do for a very long time.
And the next topic will be let's see. How bad was Dragon Ball Evolution?
What's the best way to make a upside down pineapple cake?
Oh. Until next time.